my talk today is going to be titled Collaborative Salmon Recovery in Fundy National Park. My name's John Whitelaw, and I'm an ecologist here at Fundy. And I do have the utmost pleasure to have Atlantic salmon recovery as one of my key projects here. So I'll try and give a general overview of kind of what we're up to in this part of the world. So I'm going to start with this first slide that sort of kind of tries to highlight a little bit of why I put collaborative in my title. And hopefully some of these pictures will illustrate it. But before I talk a bit about that, I just want to mention kind of Parks Canada mandate. We do have that mandate to protect and ultimately present, you know, the 46 national parks across the country. And here I am, and here we are talking about Fundy National Park. And when it comes to salmon and the work I'm going to try and explain, it really is, along with our partners, our objective here is to increase salmon abundance and restore kind of that broader ecosystem integrity. And I don't think it's an understatement or too strong of words to say, without sort of the collaborative efforts over the years, you know, without that, I'm sure sort of we would have been sitting with extirpated populations here in the park. So yeah, picture worth 1,000 words. Off to the left shows kind of where we started way back, the number of people involved. Fast forward a bunch of years, and we've got a picture of at least a collection, and certainly not everybody that's involved, but it really is an example of true collaboration, and it's just presents such a powerful workforce when you've got this collection of diverse partners. So I did want to start out by just a significant shout out to everybody involved. I'm going to give a quick just geography and background. Most people are probably aware, but here we are on the southern shores of Nova Scotia and Fundy National Park in what they call the Inner Bay of Fundy designatable unit. Unfortunately, our populations here were declared federally endangered in 2003. Talking about sort of those historic levels of in the tune of 40,000 fish, adults returning to sort of the Inner Bay of Fundy rivers. Now with sort of the most recent number estimates, it's well below sort of 200 that are returning. The majority of those 40 rivers within this complex are extirpated. The other point, marine survival appears to be one of the most limiting factors for recovery. And certainly a well-deserved shout out that live gene banking operations through DFO and certainly Parks Canada is involved as well, are kind of one of the reasons why there is still Inner Bay of Fundy fish still swimming around out there. So zooming in just a little bit more to actually Fundy Park itself. So black line surrounds Fundy National Park. We're approximately 200 square kilometers of park, and our salmon rivers we're working on and we'll be talking about are the Upper Salmon River, sort of to the east of the park. Shown here in blue, the watershed in blue, and then to the west of the park, the Point Wolf River, as indicated, yellow surrounding the watershed there. And one point I wanted to also make, we'll talk a lot about numbers of fish here and how the fish are so important, and we're looking at fish at various stages and numbers, but often what does get lost in certain circles is not only the loss of fish, but also the loss of that sort of broader ecosystem from the sort of disappearance of those marine derived nutrients that flow in from the migrating species or migrating salmon from the marine environment, or fish that we actually physically put in the river from the marine environment. We certainly have a historical record of stocking. The majority of the historical stocking has been stocking with par for the most part, and it really has been pretty much ineffective in recovering our populations. So I do want to give a little bit of history. I know I'm reaching back here quite a ways, but I think the history is important to sort of know why we are where we are today. So in 2003, I mentioned sort of our Inner Bay of Fundy population was designated endangered. And it was at that point we kind of stepped in as an agency and as a collaborative group along with DFO and other partners to really just collect the last remnant wild smolts that we had sort of in our rivers before they sort of entered the bay and disappeared and not returned. So there was efforts immediately upon listing and realizing our stocks were sort of blanking out of collecting and operating this live gene bank, of which I won't discuss sort of the finer details of what a gene bank is, but I will mention we entered that live gene bank world in 2003. We collected fish, we reintroduced them, and our main priority here was conserving the genetics and protecting that population from disappearing. But there was also, you know, of course, a release component. So I just want to talk about the right side of the screen here. It's a quick depiction of the old style live gene bank, collecting remnant wild smolts from our rivers, bringing them to the DFO run Mactaquac Biodiversity Facility, rear those fish to maturity, spawn controlled spawnings of a designated number to maintain family diversity, and releasing juveniles in various stages, one being fry and one being par. And there was some adults that were released, but my next few slides are going to concentrate on sort of what sort of fell out of some of our observations from these fry and par stockings in the early days. And really, what it was showing us early on is we were noticing that, you know, the fry stocking and par stocking strategies were both showing sort of different looking smolts. And we started asking ourselves questions, so does that matter over time? And we, at that point, sort of wanted to sort of look into this a little deeper. And this is when we sort of took our first step towards partnering with industry to examine. So my next slide will sort of try and describe this life cycle research project that we embarked upon with industry. And it really was sort of the first step, releasing fry, releasing par from the live gene bank loop that was ongoing to protect and preserve. And I'll note the fry would be released sort of as unfed in May. The par would be released approximately 5 months later in October. So I'll be speaking a lot about kind of reduced captive exposure and sort of extended captive exposure. So let's just sort of frame fry as being very reduced captive exposure, limited time in the hatchery, par being sort of extended captive exposure, spending an extra 5 months in the hatchery. So we wanted to take a look at these two strategies and see if it was producing different results for our fish. So the next step would have been as these fry or par matured to smolts and started emigrating out of the river, we would have captured them in our rotary screw traps. We would have been able to tell the fry origin smolts from having their adipose and the par origin smolts from not having their adipose because of a clip that we provided. And we looked at those smolts and tried to figure out if there was differences. We also followed those smolts through to transport to the marine environment, and this is where the industry came in. And we wanted to look at these smolts while they were reared in the marine environment to see sort of through that rearing and as adults, was there also differences here, whether it was released originally as a fry or a par. And then the final step, once those fish matured in the marine environment, we wanted to take a look at sort of the gametes, or specifically the eggs and embryos, and again, see if there was a difference based on sort of the release strategy of fry versus par. So that was kind of what we were sort of embarking upon in this original life cycle research project. My next slide, I'll just show a bit of the results. So there was a primary publication. It was part of Corey Clark's master's work. Corey still remains here at Fundy National Park and very active still in the salmon program. And I'm going to go through this quick, but really off to the right are sort of some highlighted things I just wanted to mention. So I talked about looking at those smolts when we captured them based on whether they were fry release or par release. So if we're looking at the top two figures, first on the left, we're looking at fish that were reduced captive exposure. You see that on the x-axis here. We're showing up to be significantly older, basically showing up as 2-year-old smolts as opposed to 1-year-old smolt. So even fish that were released 5 months later, so the par were coming out as smolts as 1-year-olds, the fry releases were coming out at 2 years old. So quite a significant difference there. Smolt weights, similar sort of separation between the reduced captive exposure of fry releases versus the par releases. So the smolt weights were larger on the fish that had reduced captive exposure. And both those things were showing that reduced captive exposure were giving us a little bit more wild-like fish. Next, sort of in these middle two figures, that's looking at fish after they've been transported to the marine environment, the marine rearing site, showing an interesting kind of revelation that the reduced captive exposed fish were sort of growing weight increase at a slower rate than the extended captive exposure fish. But once those fish matured, those fish that were released as fry or reduced captive exposure were actually larger in weight than their counterparts that were released as par. So again, sort of showing some differences with time in captivity, and showing that the fish with less time in captivity were sort of showing signs of being more wild-like. And then for the last two figures on the bottom here, this is when we actually took some of those mature fish and spawned them and looked at egg diameter for the fish released as fry and less captive exposure. The eggs were larger than their counterparts. And then moving on to the bottom right figure, we were looking at viability of the embryos, and we're showing significant increases in survival in the fish that were released as fry and the less captive exposure. So what does that all mean? Very sort of long-winded way of saying a very simple thing, that less captivity equals more wild fitness. And that's probably not a huge surprise to people, but seeing it in this light and some of the specifics was very interesting to us, and complemented a lot of sort of other literature that was sort of popping up, and really came into the world, or sort of started making ourselves ask that question of, could we do one better? Could we release adult fish into our rivers, and therefore our progeny or offspring would have no captive exposure? And would that make a difference to sort of move this needle more towards recovery? So that whole process really just kind of led us to almost where we are today. But through the process of that research, we realized, one, the capacity that industry has, the experience that industry has, and the interest they had in salmon recovery. So this is sort of led to the establishment of the first dedicated wild salmon marine conservation farm. And it's located in Grand Manan, a place called Dark Harbor. Off to the right, you'll see sort of Dark Harbor from above. It's a nice protected little bay there with just a little gut connecting it to the main Bay of Fundy. And it is strictly dedicated for wild salmon conservation. So the function of that site, I guess I should say just quickly that, it's owned by the village of Grand Manan, operated by Cook Aquaculture, and it really is sort of shared between a variety of groups. Particularly what's going on there now is Fundy National Park is using it as a platform for salmon restoration work here in the park, and Fort Folly First Nations is using it as a platform for their restoration work on that Petitcodiac. So The function of that site is really quite simply to take a proportion of the smolts from our wild rivers, bring them to the marine rearing farm where they will mature, and after that they're released and back to their native rivers to spawn naturally on their own. So that is kind of one of the big platforms that provides fish and energy for our restoration work here in Fundy. And I mean, one of the backbones, as I mentioned, one of the functions of that marine rearing site is adult releases. So that's the backbone of a lot of our restoration work. We do adult releases on the Upper Salmon River and the Point Wolf River. Upper Salmon's been going on for quite some time. Point Wolf River has just been brought online for adult releases from our marine site. It varies year to year, but generally we look at releasing anywhere from 400 to 1,000 fish, adult fish, to the park every year. And we utilize a variety of different methods of release. Helicopters we utilize for the more remote locations. We release some by hand. We've created these cool little slides that we can send fish down pipes to the rivers. We release some in the summer and some later in the fall. So there's a variety of release strategies we're using, and I'm not going to get into it for today's talk, but I'll just plant the seed that we are embarking upon some genetic work that will ultimately allow us to do parental analysis and sort of really examine reproductive success across those different release strategies across both rivers, and really start to enlighten us on sort of the performance of these fish that we're releasing into Fundy National Park. All the fish that we release are both internally and externally tagged. So for the external, you might be able to see it, probably doesn't show up, but we've got Floy tags or spaghetti tags for the external markers, and everybody's internally tagged with a 23 millimeter pit tag. And that may come in to play in a couple slides later. I'll talk a little bit about the monitoring of those adults. So that's adult releases, and that, like I say, that sets the stage for a lot of our monitoring and a lot of our restoration work. So just a quick slide here showing kind of what our core monitoring activities are in Fundy National Park. We've got juvenile density monitoring using electrofishing. I'll talk briefly about that. We've got smolt monitoring as those fish are leaving our rivers as smolts. And we've got adult return monitoring using a variety of methods to monitor for anybody that's swimming back up into our rivers. Before I leave this slide, I do just want to mention I don't have much built into my presentation about it, but when we're talking about monitoring activities, if we're talking about sort of just research in the broad sense, I do want to mention that we've just recently embarked upon a pretty exciting sort of phase of our salmon work, and that's really the establishment of Parks Canada's first ever research chair. It's in aquatic restoration. I'm sure probably a lot of the folks on this listening in know Dr. Kurt Samways. He's our new research chair, or relatively new research chair. So I won't spend really much time talking about sort of that world, other than it's just opened up this huge door really, and created just such tremendous capacity from sort of the pure and applied science perspective to kind of take some of the data that's generated through the monitoring program at Fundy, or take a lot of the platform that we're using for restoration and really look at kind of the broader ecosystem impacts of our restoration efforts, and not just at Fundy, but also across 5 national parks in Atlantic Canada. So I just wanted to give a shout out there of that capacity. So first, really quickly, juvenile density monitoring is one thing I mentioned. Of course, for us anyway, this is the first opportunity to see if adults are successfully spawning. Our method is electrofishing. We do it both on Upper Salmon River and Point Wolf River every year. We have closed sites, we have open sites. Whoops, and yeah, it's due time to flip. And this slide really just show this. This slide here shows juvenile densities in a figure, and I'll just walk through really quickly. Ultimately, it's let's see, we've got juvenile densities there on the y-axis, years on the bottom, and Upper Salmon River juvenile densities are indicated with the gray triangle. Point Wolf juvenile densities with the black dot. Won't spend too much time here other than just pointing out for the upper salmon, you can kind of follow that decreasing sort of population trend to the point where we're kind of flatlining. Late 90s through the early 2000s. Fast forward to sort of the 2014 when we really started to get our feet wet with the marine rearing project. And then we're starting to see that increasing trend in juvenile densities on the Upper Salmon River, which is certainly encouraging for us. Point Wolf River, on the other hand, you sort of see again that declining trend through the late 90s and then the flat line. So you're seeing sort of a flat line continuing for Point Wolf, but that is really because we haven't done any adult releases or significant restoration work on the Point Wolf up until just recently. So I mentioned the Point Wolf coming online, and now in subsequent years, hopefully what we will see is that black dot also sort of showing that increasing trend in juvenile density. So fingers crossed. Yes, increasing trends in the Upper Salmon River, Point Wolf River just brought online. And oh yeah, the other point I want to make here is like this increasing trend is completely naturally produced fish. So this isn't from any fry stocking, par stocking. This is all from those adult releases or natural returns. Basically laying those eggs, naturally spawning, and everything sort of that's produced is naturally produced. Next up, smolt monitoring. Really quick one here. As they're coming out, we certainly do monitor. We use rotary screw traps. It's dual purpose, one to provide run estimates, smolt run estimates, and also to collect a portion of those fish to feed our marine rearing operations. We deploy smolt wheels on both Upper Salmon and Point Wolf. I don't have a graph, unfortunately, created for this, but I did want to just give a mention that last year, even though for Miramichi type folk, 5,000 smolts might not sound a lot, but that was the tune of our number last year. And from a perspective of Fundy National Park, that 5,000 smolt run on the Upper Salmon River represents the highest numbers of naturally produced smolts we've seen in the 20 years we've been monitoring smolts, smolt wheels. So that we think is pretty relevant. And again, those are all naturally produced smolts. So adult return monitoring, that's always the exciting one, seeing what's coming back to us. So we deploy a variety of methods. And of course, we're seeking to find out if we've got any returns from the smolts coming back, or what we're also looking for is adult fish that have been released in previous years that are returning back as repeat spawners. And I'll get into that a little bit in the next slide. We use a variety of different methods for surveys. We've got dive surveys that we snorkel the rivers every month throughout the migratory run. We've got pit tag antenna arrays or RFID gates, and I'll talk about that in a minute. And we deploy seining at times and marker capture to try and give us some decent estimates. So again, my next graph will illustrate this a tiny little bit, but I did want to also just mention here that last year we had 115 naturally returning fish to Fundy, and that did mark a sort of 30-year high for us. So, and this next slide sort of illustrates sort of the adult returns coming back to Fundy. But before we get sort of too excited, I do want to sort of make sure that people are aware of what these fish depicted in this graph are. And these fish are actually adults that would have been released in previous years and are returning as repeat spawners. So that's been a really interesting and positive twist on our program. So our intent originally for rearing adult fish and releasing them in any given year was to release them as mature fish to spawn in that year. And they have been doing that. We've seen the evidence of them producing those juvenile densities that we were talking about. But what was kind of a pleasant surprise is not only were they contributing in that year, but they were leaving our rivers as kelts, spending time in the bay anywhere from 1 to 2 years, and then returning back to us at really high rates, what we consider high rates as repeat spawners. Like I don't have anything here to illustrate, but we're talking like last couple of years, 15, 18% of them are returning as repeat spawners. And that's really what we're looking at here in this graph. And I'll walk you through real quick to the left with the blue bars. This is Upper Salmon River, starting along the bottom with the year, and of course the numbers of returns on the y-axis there. But if you follow along from 2002 on the left right through, we're seeing that flat line period where we had 1, 2, zeros, like just hardly anything coming back. We see a little bump in 2012, and that sort of reflects that life cycle experiment or life cycle research project that I was talking about. There was some fish released there that generated a little bump in releases. And then fast forward sort of 2014, 2015 is when we started ramping up our marine rearing program. And then all of a sudden we're starting to see a lot of those fish return as repeat spawners. So, and a similar story if we move over to the right on the point wolf with the red bars, kind of the same kind of deal. Flat line and very few numbers, if any, through the early 2000s, a little bump in 2012 from the research project, and then nothing until 2021. And because we just see that initial first blip, that's because we just brought Point Wolf River online a couple years ago. So anyway, won't have time to get into it, but obviously there's a gold standard, and what everybody looks for is a truly wild return. But if those returns come back in incredible shape, of which they are, and are contributing to the spawning, effective spawning population size in Fundy, we'll take them. Yes, and I, at risk of perhaps jumping around a little bit, if you remember, I did mention pit tag antennas or RFID gates earlier on as a method for us to monitor our adult returns. What they are, for people that don't know, is, okay, so I mentioned that all of our fish are implanted that we release, anything through a program that's released are implanted with a pit tag. And on the mouths of both the Point Wolf River and the Upper Salmon River, we have these radio frequency identifier gates that when a fish with a pit tag either swims in or out of our river, we get a record of it. And sort of the top right picture is the actual thing, just showing you a bit of the scale. They're large things, and really the largest known application that we're kind of aware of, but they were really researched, developed, tested through UNB and UNB scientists in Fundy. And we've basically liked them so much, we've adopted them and operationalized them as part of our monitoring component for returns. And I just wanted to show you down below kind of some of the data that can be generated. And I'll go through this quickly. I realize I'm running out of time here, but yeah, so this depicts a little bit of the data generated last year on the Upper Salmon River. So if we're looking at the y-axis, this is time from 0 to 24, so noon in the middle. Along the x-axis is the periods that we're having this gate operational, from July to December, to try and capture everything coming and going. The legend here, so anywhere we see sort of these dark gray bars are periods in time where that array is not working, whether it's from a high water event that's blown it out or squirrel chewing through a power cord. That's sort of what we're seeing there. anything with a light gray backdrop is reading. And then we've got our red triangles showing fish that were released and yellow triangles for natural returns. So just a quick scan here. We're seeing our bulk of our natural returns coming back to Fundy last year in the upper salmon from July through to start of August. And then not much else the rest of the year. The red triangles were, of course, the releases. We see a little smattering of them here. That is because we had our captive adult release happen sort of the second week of September, first week of September. And these just loose cluster in the middle of a few red triangles are fish that kind of just were wandering around and hitting the gate down below the release site. And then if we just move off to the far right, we're seeing a lot of action, sort of that end October through November period. And then that, of course, corresponds with spawning. And we're seeing both the natural returns and our released fish kind of all doing that mass exodus following spawning. And to point out, I guess, just because it's such a significant difference than sort of the Miramichi area, our fish leave our rivers after spawning. So they're out in the fall. They don't overwinter in our rivers. Our rivers just aren't conducive to that overwintering of a kelp. So that's that. And I am probably going to, I had this slide, I'm going to skip over it. I think I'll make one mention. This was going to depict some of Kurt Samways' work. Looking at the broader ecosystem perspective, I'm not going to go through the graph, but I'm just going to point out there's been some very interesting work looking at things from the broader perspective, and that's sort of the impact or the effect of these adults being released into our river, basically increasing, prolonging and raising the ecosystem productivity by some measures that Dr. Samways was looking at. So we're not only sort of looking at increasing the numbers just because we want higher effective population, spawning population, but we're looking at sort of these numbers as providing that true value, huge value to the broader ecosystem and improving that ecosystem productivity. Yeah, for the matter of time, I think this will be where I'll end it. I just wanted to just quickly say this is an experimental model for restoration. We're still tweaking it. We adaptively manage. We'll see where it goes, but certainly we're seeing some encouraging signs. Increasing trends in juvenile abundance, the natural returns coming back to us, and these ecosystem productivity increases, which I didn't spend too much time talking about, but all those are extremely exciting for us and those involved with work here. But I think it's fair. We have to obviously temper some of our sort of excitement with the, acknowledgement and the realization that, the limiting factor in the marine environment hasn't gone away. We're doing things to try and prepare our fish to be as fit as possible and hopefully move the needle more towards higher marine survival. But acknowledgement that that's still an issue that needs to be addressed before we can have much in the way of clear sailing. So thanks, folks.